Hello, my name is Benjamin Powell. I'm the apiculturist for Clemson University in South Carolina. Clemson is a land grant university which supports agriculture and natural resource enterprises statewide. My role is to run the apiculture and pollinator program, which is the extension and research program to support beekeepers and beekeeping operations, as well as raise awareness in the general public about the plight of pollinators and their importance to agriculture and ecosystems. If you're tuning into this talk, it's probably because you've heard about North America's newest honeybee pest, the yellow-legged hornet, or Vespa volutna. We are on the doorstep of the introduction of Vespa volutna here in South Carolina, and we've had an opportunity to observe it and its behaviors and its status. So with all the discussion that's happening about this hornet, we figured it might be a good idea to share our observations with you. So we've got a quick presentation. We're just going to discuss its current status, where the hornet is, what efforts are in place to control and manage its spread, and what the potential for new introduction is. We'll also discuss its biology and behaviors. It's got some really interesting things that it does, which also make it very concerning. And then we'll wrap it up with some recommendations on management and control. So if you'll stick with us, we're going to give you a thorough run through of what we've learned about the yellow-legged hornet. Without further delay, let's get into the presentation. I'm going to start off talking about the current situation and the status of the hornet, where it exists, and what efforts are underway to manage its spread. You also get a little feel for what the landscape's like in the area to understand why this is such a challenging pest. Then we'll transition into the biology and behavior, talk a little bit more about the fun stuff about this particular creature, which makes it also not so fun. And then we'll wrap it up with some recommendations on how to control and manage this pest. In August of 2023, Georgia Department of Agriculture sent out a press release indicating that they had collected live specimens of the yellow-legged hornet near Savannah, Georgia. They received the initial suggestion from a beekeeper that saw a suspicious insect hovering around their hive entrance, actually collected the specimen and had the wherewithal to submit it to authorities for identification. That would-be beekeeper was the first instance of public reporting of the yellow-legged hornet. The USDA got involved along with the University of Georgia to confirm that identification and did so, which launched Georgia into action. Georgia Department of Agriculture started spreading traps around the region, knocking on doors, expanding awareness and outreach to get the public involved in determining where and when these hornets are active. All of the observations that they made and were reported to them were centered around Wilmington Island and the Thunderbolt area, which is on the coastal side of downtown Savannah, Georgia. Due to public awareness and the reporting portal, a resident nearby the initial sighting reported a nest up in their tree. Now, this was a giant nest. The nest was about the size of a 30-gallon trash can. And it probably escaped detection because it was like 80 feet high in the top of a pine tree, very high up. And so even a nest that large looked pretty small and inconspicuous. Upon learning about the nest, they jumped into action, got the nest removed and treated, and continued trapping. Unfortunately, the traps continued catching hornets, which suggested additional nests were in the area. Georgia continued expanding their trapping, trying to make sure they were, knew where the hornets were, and had traps outside of that range just to confirm that they weren't anywhere else. Had 170 traps by the end of the season, and thanks to the trapping and public reporting, removed an additional 4 nests. So they had 5 nests removed in the first year, and were tracking a 6th nest as we got into the winter time and it started to get to frost and cold temperatures. Hornet activity dropped, and they no longer were able to find that last nest. Meanwhile, they did document hawking behavior or predatory behavior on honeybee colonies. Soon as we got the press release, we launched
trapping program as well. So our Department of Plant Industry, which is actually housed in Clemson University, not in the Department of Agriculture, is responsible for invasive species management. And so DPI spread traps across the area, focusing largely on the riverfront and the uplands closest to Savannah there to see if any hornets were active on our side of the river. Uh, Contacted all the beekeepers we knew then were in the area, told them about the hornet, what it does, and then launched a citizen reporting portal. We had no reports of hawking activity. We had no credible submissions to the reporting portal, and none of our traps turned up any hornets until the very end of November. And in November, we started catching some drones, which told us two things. One, a nest was somewhere that had eluded detection. And that nest was probably close to that Georgia population because that's where we were seeing activity. But two, there was a nest that was able to go through reproduction, which means it dispersed new queens and drones into the environment. In 2024, that changed for us. We actually had our first nest reported in March. It was a little embryo nest that a homeowner saw and had seen our outreach materials and notified us about it. It was confirmed as a yellow-legged hornet nest, even though the hornet was not present. So we had our first nest and we expanded trapping. So the USDA got involved, helped with some funding, and we were able to expand trapping. Our traps were over 700, Georgia's were over 1,200 for a total of about 2,000 traps around the region dispersed all across the area. We started catching hornets in our traps largely in the area right around Bluffton and Hilton Head. Meanwhile, Georgia was catching hornets all around Savannah and out towards Tybee Island and inland up towards Statesboro. By the end of 2024, we had removed 16 nests. Georgia had removed 49 for a total of 65 nests across the region removed. 2025 saw an additional expansion, both in the number and range. We started getting nest or trap detections out into the more rural areas and areas well away from where we saw the initial detections. And we also started seeing nests. And the public has been very helpful in that. Our outreach efforts were very effective. So the nest or the trapping program got expanded to over 3,000 traps across the region, collected nearly 25,000 hornets in all those traps, and were able to find and remove over 150 nests. Not exactly sure what that number is because we haven't gotten the most recent data from Georgia, but we got 100 nests in South Carolina. So the hornets expanded both in range and in number. And like I said, Georgia's seeing kind of the same thing on their side. From that initial population at Wilmington Island, they have spread inland and kind of radially from that initial location. So here's kind of a sequence of events. So red is the first year, 2023, blue is 2024, and pink would be, or magenta is 2025. So you'll notice that right there are near Wilmington Island and Thunderbolt areas where the first nests were found. Detections and nests expanded about 25 miles in both directions in the first year, and then expanded again about 25 more miles in all directions the next year. So we now have had hornet detections all the way from Seabrook Island, which is in Charleston County, all the way south to St. Catherine's Island in Georgia, which is down getting closer to Brunswick, and inland towards Statesboro. Up until the end of the year, we thought that that's just all the expansion we were going to see until we got a report from a beekeeper well away from this initial population. And this actually got a lot of stir. We started hearing folks talking about this in social media and on videos that we had found the first hotspot. A hornet was reported by a beekeeper in York County which is in the northern part of South Carolina, right on the North Carolina border, just below Charlotte. This beekeeper knew what they were looking at, saw it, captured one, reported it. Our teams went up there, trapped, caught their own hornets, and within a week had found the nest and removed it. Unfortunately, that did not happen until November, which was right during the reproductive phase for these hornets. So the likelihood of new hornets getting dispersed to that location and additional nests happening in the spring seems to be pretty high. But what this does show us is that these hornets will travel with people. And it does seem quite likely that the new novel populations could show up just about anywhere in the country. You know, Savannah, Georgia, Hilton Head, the coastal part of South Carolina and Georgia there is a favorite wintering location for people from all over the nation and in Canada. It is a beautiful habitat with expansive estuaries and salt marshes, wetlands, and productive sportsman activities. It's just a beautiful place to be, and the mild climate makes it just wonderful to be there in the wintertime when the biting insects are not so bad. Problem is folks move and they will spend the winter there and then they'll move elsewhere, go back home in the spring or summer before the bugs and the heat get bad. And that does mean that folks that are wintering or vacationing in this area do have the potential for carrying a hornet home with them. So our predictions for next year, basically just using a quadratic linear equation, um, is that we're probably going to have close to 300 nests next year that will be in that area. And if they continue to expand their range about 20, 25 miles, then they will expand into Charleston. They will expand inland past Statesboro and probably south down to Brunswick, Georgia. So we suspect in 2026, folks in Charleston are going to start to experience this hornet. Also, the numbers will increase. The curve is still on an increase, and we are going to probably see close to 300 nests there. We are going to trap intensively around that isolated population in York County where that one nest was found. We don't want that to be a foundry population to start a whole new invasion. So they will work diligently and very intensively to eradicate any nest that may have been produced from that one that was removed. The way they do that is through a broad brush of trapping, extensive trapping in the region where it's active and outside of it, just to make sure that the population's contained. Our traps are simple jug traps, the half-gallon or gallon jug traps with a hole cut in them, and they are baited with grape juice and brown sugar. Those traps are checked weekly, and the bait is changed out on a weekly basis. Right now, there's over 3,200 traps that have been distributed down there in the low country, and those traps are checked weekly. So there's a tremendous amount of labor and time and travel associated with monitoring these traps. All of the hornets that are caught in these traps, at least in South Carolina, have been preserved and cataloged. So for later analysis, which we're going to be doing some of next year. When a nest is reported or found, our teams have some pretty significant logistics to deal with. Oftentimes, the nest may be relatively low to the ground and or on a building or structure where they can be easily accessed with just a ladder or a small lift. But this particular hornet seems to have an affinity for building its terminal nest, its final nest, high in the tree canopy. I mean, like at the very apex of the tree. And many of the nests that have been removed to this point have been over 100 feet off the ground. At least one was so high that there was not a lift or cherry picker that could reach it. They had to contract a crane. So you can imagine we've got to be able to get this equipment in there to actually get up to the nest to treat it and remove it. Now, every nest is treated with an insecticide to kill all its individuals, and those nests are cut out and preserved for later analysis. So you can imagine that this method of nest removal is okay in residential and urban areas and seems to work where we've got the infrastructure to be able to do it. But deploying this kind of equipment in swamps and tidal estuaries and sea islands is pretty much impossible. So the landscape is also giving us some very significant challenges. If you've ever visited Hilton Head or Savannah, Charleston, or some of these coastal communities, you know how just striking the landscape is. These expansive estuaries, tidal estuaries, are some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. The amount of sheer biomass and fish and shellfish that these systems produce is phenomenal, and it makes it a very attractive place for people as well. It's a sportsman's paradise where you have opportunities to enjoy nature in so many different ways, and that has led to large uh, properties that are managed for wildlife and are privately owned, and many of which are actually industrial pine lands and have absentee homeowners. These landowners may live across the country and only visit a few times a year. So much of the landscape is inaccessible down there. Now, this is not to make excuses. I mean, it's just a very, very significant challenge. If there was a perfect place for this hornet to show up in the United States, this is it. It's so much like home back in Southeast Asia. So it makes sense that there's ample habitat for this particular creature and very challenging landscape features to work around if you're trying to manage it. The good news is through good, strong outreach and awareness, the public has a vested interest and is helping, not just beekeepers, but the general public. More than half of the nests that we have removed have been reported by residents and the general public. They're helping. They understand the plight of the beekeeper. That novel population that was up in York County was reported by a beekeeper who knew what to look for and knew how to handle the report. And it's kind of striking too. I was talking with the first person who managed the websites, and we have reporting portals for a lot of different invasive species. And what she said was the submissions that were coming into the Yellow-Legged Hornet reporting portal were strikingly accurate compared to most of the other portals that we have. People know what they're looking at. They have a vested interest and they're doing. So we believe that the outreach efforts have been pretty effective. That being said, the landscape, the biology of this creature has made it where it's been able to establish and continue to spread despite these efforts. So let's talk about what the hornet's doing so that you kind of know what to look for and maybe how to manage it. First of all, it's a hornet, and that means it is a member of the genus Vespa. Now, Vespa are almost all from Southeast Asia. There's 22 species in total, like 19 of them come from Indo-Malaysia. So that southeast corner of Asia, which is very similar habitat and climate to southeastern United States. A lot of invasive species from Southeast Asia have found homes in southeastern United States. But Vespa velutina is particularly problematic because of all of the hornets that are in that range, it has the widest range of tolerances. It lives in tropical areas, subtropical areas, wet climates, alpine climates, as well as temperate climates. So it has a wide temperature tolerance, wide habitat tolerances, and compared to most of its congeners, has one of the widest ranges. Now, there's only two other species of hornets that have a wider range, and those are the European hornet, which was able to migrate all the way to Europe, and the Oriental hornet, which is across the Middle East and Northern Africa. But next to those two species, Vespa velutina has the widest range. And hornets in general have remarkable abilities to inhabit new locations. Hornets are apex predators. They tend to have relatively general diets foraging on a lot of different prey. Um, and being that they're larger bodied and social insects means that they are pretty tolerant of a wider range of climate parameters and maybe habitats. So hornets get introduced all over the world. And y'all remember well, I hate to call it murder hornet because it's not a murder hornet, but northern giant hornet, aka murder hornet, introduced into Vancouver and Washington State back in 2019. Um, but it's not the only one. Several other species have. None of them have been able to be as invasive as the yellow-legged hornet, though. The yellow-legged hornet was introduced to Europe, Korea, Japan, more recently the United States, and then literally hot off the presses just a month ago, New Zealand mentioned that they had now detected yellow-legged hornets. So this particular species of hornet seems to be much more adaptive than even the rest of its congeners, which means that it's kind of concerning that it's reached the United States. It does seem that it has a high potential to spread. Now, why is that? Well, it's been able to nest. We've actually been able to identify that only 3 of the hornets that have ever been introduced in the United States, at least that we know of, have ever been able to reproduce here. First one was the European hornet, which, it has that wide range across the temperate parts of Europe and Asia. So it was already pretty well suited to North America. It just took a boat ride to get over here for it to work. The northern giant hornet, also more temperate climate loving, but slightly narrower habitat requirements. But the northern giant hornet was able to nest up there in Washington State. It did collapse, though. Its population collapsed. It was not nearly as effective at nesting as the yellow-legged hornet has been. The yellow-legged hornet has been observed nesting in much higher densities than even the European hornet was reported. And this is kind of following the trends that our colleagues saw over in Europe when it was introduced in 2004. It's suspected to have been brought in a stack of pots into France. It's spread across Western France. And while this map's a little out of date, it pretty much ranges from Italy, west to Portugal, north to the British Isles, and east to Germany. So it continues to expand its range even in that area. This track record of invasiveness, though, just suggests that it does have the potential to expand its range across larger areas of North America. Why is that? Well, I would argue that the biggest part of its biology that makes it so much more invasive than its other species is that it does something just like the honeybees do. It actually performs polyandry. The queen mates with multiple drones, which means that a single mated queen has enough genetic diversity to start an entirely new population. Notice the Vespa mandarinia, which is kind of in the middle here, on average mates with 1, maybe 2 drones, which might explain why it was not as effective at producing large number of nests up in Washington State. The yellow-legged hornet, on the other hand, actually may mate with 4 or 5 or more drones, which explains why it's been able to establish in all these different locations. And probably each of those establishments was a single mated queen who was able to nest, produce drones and queens, and some of those drones and queens were able to mate with each other. They're brothers and sisters, but they had different fathers. And as a result, that means that they now are not inbred or they could hybridize. The other major factor of why the yellow-legged hornet is so invasive and adaptive is its feeding behaviors. It's well known that it feeds on honeybees, because honeybees are easy to catch and are a reliable source of food that pretty much stays in one spot. A honeybee colony produces thousands of individuals that the hornets can catch, and those are at one spot. So once the hornet learns where a honeybee hive is, it can revisit that location and continue collecting food for its nest. But what we've also observed, which caught us a little off guard, I guess, was that it eats just about any kind of protein. The hornets need to feed their larvae animal tissues. They're still predators or scavengers to some effect. Their larvae must eat animal tissue. So the hornet captures an insect or chews up some meat, brings it back to the larva, and then the larva actually rewards the adult hornet with a little sugary sweet droplet, some carbohydrates and essential amino acids. So they feed each other. It's sort of this feedback loop. So the more protein the workers can gather, the more they get fed by their sisters. So what ends up happening is these hornets, they start catching or collecting food from just about anything. We've seen them on deer carcasses. We've seen them on dead fish out there in those really, really productive estuaries. We've seen bait shops or folks with bait have the hornets come to their shrimp and other shellfish. This ecosystem where the hornet showed up, one of the most productive fish and shellfish systems in the entire Atlantic rim. So there's ample food there, even despite the honeybees. That's not all they eat, though. The adults, they need carbohydrates. They need to eat sugary sweet fluids. And we've found that they eat just about any kind of sugary sweet fluid they can get. Nectar on flowers, old ripening fruit. They're dumpster diving, going into trash cans, drinking old soda cans, and hummingbird feeders, or any kind of sugary syrup bait that gets put out there. And so they just have this really, really broad diet, which means if they find a new location, they could probably find something to eat. So I got a few videos of some of this. You'll notice this hornet on the left is hovering around a deer carcass. A deer carcass is a pretty reliable source of flies. And we also watch the hornet land on the deer carcass and scrape off meat tissue. So they were foraging on the carcass. And while they're out doing this, they're coming to these feeding station or feeding locations. If they encounter another predatory wasp, that's on the menu too. So we see at these feeding stations, these hornets catching yellow jackets and wasps and bees and, other insects that you would think might be able to defend themselves fairly well. And then lastly, we see them eating just about any kind of sugar. So any ripening fruit. We've seen them in orchards or in people's backyards that have fruit trees with fruit falling to the ground. Yeah. So if you want to invade a new location, it helps to be able to eat just about whatever's there. It also helps to be able to make a home just about anywhere there. And they have extremely generalized nesting habits. The material that they make their paper mache nest out of is wood fiber. Just like bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets and those umbrella paper wasps, they chew off the bark or the wood fibers on a tree, and then they make that paste into the nest. And they can form it into comb or into these envelopes. And the nests that we've been removing are multicolored. The little chewed marks look like they come from just about every kind of tree. We haven't really tested what all the different tree materials are there, but we suspect they're pretty much getting wood fiber from wherever wood fiber is available. They're also building these nests in just about every location. We thought, oh, these are going to be an open nesting creature. They're going to be out on tree canopies, kind of like bald-faced hornets tend to be. They almost always build their nests in open areas. Not this one. When they build their early nests, oftentimes they're in cavities. We've seen them in water mains and light sockets, seen them under the eaves or soffits of houses. And as the nests get bigger or they transition that terminal nest, they move into the vegetation. Sometimes they stay low to the ground. Sometimes they go all the way to the top of the tree, just like we showed you in that video. So they can nest just about anywhere. But what we have actually seen, though, is they do seem to nest close to human habitat. There's an awful lot of nests that are in trap activity seem to be closely associated with human development. Uh, Another adaptive behavior that they have is that they have maternal care. They're a social insect. right? And so they tend for their brood and they have division of labor, just like honeybees do. And that creates some, social immunity and adaptiveness. But it also means that they have an ability to reserve food. Now, they don't do what honeybees do. Honeybees collect nectar, dry it down to honey, convert it, and then pack it in a cell and store it for later use. Kind of do something similar with bee bread. So they get food and they store it for later use. The hornets don't do that. When they collect food, they consume it. But the way they store food reserves is actually in their larvae. So the hornets, the foragers are collecting meat tissue, insects or animal tissues, and feeding their larvae. And then the larvae are regurgitating this carbohydrate diet with amino acids. So the larvae are actually the food reserve, which is kind of interesting. That means the more larvae they have, the more resilient the colony is, and is able to grow exponentially over time. So this maternal care and social behavior and food reserves means that they have the ability to live in maybe more marginal habitats. And then I guess one of the most important parts of being able to invade a new place is whether or not you can reproduce. Well, we don't really know exactly how many queens are being produced in each of these nests in our low country, but we do know it's very, very suitable habitat with ample food reserves and suitable nesting sites, which means that they probably are maximizing their queen and drone production at the end of the year. In France, I mean, the numbers we got to go by, in France, they have observed them, producing 200 to 300 queens each year, with the possibility of being twice that or less than that. I mean, I think there's a lot of variability there. I suspect that that's what we're experiencing too, that each nest that we miss or is not removed is producing somewhere 2, 3, maybe 400 queens at the end of the season, which means you go from a single queen to 300. That's extremely high reproductive success. And then they disperse rapidly. I mean, not only are they super strong flyers, I mean, this is a pretty large bodied insect with highly adapted wing and flight structures. They can fly in a wind. They can fly when it's cold. We've seen hornet foraging activity in the 50s Fahrenheit. So they do seem to be able to fly even in marginal conditions, but they also do it multiple times through the season. Most of our other insects that have this kind of biology where they produce a paper nest and they grow their colony through the year and then disperse queens, they tend to stay in one spot. Not this one. They will, in the winter, they overwinter in some hiding spot that gets them protected from the environment, from the cold and the rain. And then in the spring, when it warms up, they disperse to find a nesting site. They'll build that little embryo nest and get started. And then they disperse again and go to a primary nest. And then they disperse again to a secondary or terminal nest. And then they disperse again when the queens come out to mate and find a new hiding spot. So they're constantly moving and advancing their emigration. What's most concerning to me is that they seem to be closely associated with human development. Um, these early nests that we're finding in the spring and early summer are very closely associated with human developments on houses, eaves, structures. Um, it's probably because it's warmer, heat island effect maybe, but also maybe because of ample food supplies that are in those areas. But the big concern for me, which increases their invasiveness, is if they're closely associated with humans, they're likely going to be transported by humans, which has already been evidenced in the population that showed up in York County. So I'll argue that this is one of the nature's most adaptive invasive species. It has generalized feeding habits, generalized nesting habits, use social behavior and brood care, It has really high reproductive rates and very strong flyers that disperse throughout the season. It's like all the factors that you would want if you wanted to invade a new place. So, um, the likelihood of this creature expanding its range, it seems to be pretty high. And I believe that all beekeepers in the nation need to be aware of this creature, what it looks like, how it behaves. So let's talk a little bit about its seasonality and what we've seen. It's not so different from what's being seen in the rest of the world. They seem to go through an annual cycle, just like most of the other species of paper nesting eusocial wasps. Um, so let's take a yellow jacket, for instance. Yellow jackets do the same thing. They overwinter as a single mated queen. That queen tends to come out in the spring as it warms up, and she starts collecting nest material, foraging, and raising brood. And then she will build that nest and pretty much does all the work herself until she has a brood cycle or two. And then the workers that she produces start taking over most of the nest building, and she transitions more into just laying eggs and staying in the nest. And then as the season progresses, that yellow jacket nest will grow in size and continue to grow until they get to the fall of the year when they reach the apex size. They go into a reproductive phase where they produce a bunch of queens and drones. Those queens and drones disperse and mate, and then they find some place to hide the winter to do the cycle over again next year. This hornet, the yellow-legged hornet, does that too, except it's about the only hornet that I know of that will move nests multiple times through the season. So when those queens come out in the springtime, they start that little embryo nest, which is about the size of a ping pong ball or tennis ball. They grow a few workers in a brood cycle or two, and then they transition to a primary nest. That primary nest will grow up to be about the size of a basketball, grow a couple hundred workers, and then they transition to a terminal nest. And that secondary or terminal nest will be high up in a tree and will be the final nest that will go through that reproductive phase. And then those queens that are produced in that yellow-legged hornet nest will disperse, mate, and find a winter hibernacula. So they do sort of the same thing, but they constantly move. And this habit of creating multiple nests and moving just adds to the complication of managing this particular pest. So here's what an embryo nest looks like. It's, like I said, about the size of a ping pong ball or a tennis ball. And then when they move to the primary nest, it's usually about the size of a basketball or volleyball. Um, and the embryo nest and the primary nest have been both very closely associated with human structures. Now, you might ask, so, well, aren't they out there in the wild too? And you're just seeing them because they're on human structures because people are looking there. Well, yeah, maybe, but our trapping data also corroborates that. The traps that we have out in the rural areas are not catching near the hornets that the traps right around the urbanized areas are catching. So it does seem that they seem to be largely associated with urban areas, but also potentially in the more rural areas. That final nest, though, it's giant. I mean, the biggest ones we've seen about the size of a 30-gallon trash bag and are usually located well off the ground, more than 50 feet high. Many of them have been over 80 feet high, all the way at the very top of the crown of the tree. So it's been quite a challenge getting these big secondary nests down when they get reported. When they get to that phase, where they have transitioned from that primary nest to that secondary nest, which sometime that's around midsummer, June, July period, we think. Um, that's when the beekeepers start reporting the hawking. So it seems like this is a major pest of honeybees, mainly in the last half of the year. We start seeing hearing reports and seeing activity around beehives even earlier, but most intensively starting about July and increasing in intensity as we go into the fall, peaking in October and early November. And what they're doing is they're hawking. They're not doing what the northern giant hornet the northern giant hornet or murder hornet got its name because it's a bully. It will actually climb inside the beehive, out muscle the bees, chew them up so that it can get in there and steal food reserves and steal the bees themselves too. This hornet is much smaller than that. This hornet is actually about the same size as the bald-faced hornet, or slightly larger than a yellow jacket. Um, and so, if it tried to go into a beehive, it would get harassed, if not outright killed. Um, this hornet avoids that by hovering around the entrance of the hive and picking off foragers as it comes and goes. So the foragers are the primary food source, not the larvae or the honey stored inside the hive. We rarely see these hornets try to go inside the hive. And the only time we do see that is if the hive has absconded or been abandoned. So, like, they got to overcome with varroa mites, absconded. Now there's unprotected larvae and food reserves in there. Hornet take advantage of that. But they don't outright go into a relatively healthy populated beehive. The challenge, though, is when they start doing this hawking behavior, the bees just kind of stop foraging. Or even if they are foraging,
Right.
fewer of them are returning to make it to supply the food for the colony. So what ends up happening is, as the hornet pressure increases in the fall of the year, the colonies start to dwindle. They're not foraging, they're not collecting new food, their numbers of bees are declining, and this is happening at one of the most critical times of year, right when the bees are trying to produce the diutinous bees, the winter bees. They're trying to build winter stores and raise these long-lived winter bees right at the time when the hornets are hammering them. And so this hawking behavior, it creates a nefarious sort of situation where it doesn't outright kill the bee colony. It makes it weaker and more susceptible to winter colony loss. And this is kind of what the European beekeepers have been reporting. Dwindling colonies in the fall that just can't survive the winter because they don't have enough bees or enough food to make it through. And this is what it looks like. So this was a trap out somebody was trying in a column on a house there near Hilton Head. And you see some of the bees that got trapped out are just hanging out on that board there. And the hornets are hovering around waiting for foragers to come and go. There's just not a lot of foragers coming and going now. Because look, we got 4, I think maybe 5 hornets at some point pressuring this one colony, and they're just not foraging. They've stopped entirely. Um, so, partially maybe because of the trap out, but 2, because the hornets are present. So the biggest concern of the hornets is truly with beekeepers and beekeeping. But I'll argue that as these things expand their range, the conflicts with humans, just the general public, are going to increase too. We don't believe that these hornets are any more of a health threat than native stinging insects. Their venom's not any more potent. They're not any more defensive than honeybees or bald-faced hornets are. Their behaviors don't really seem to make them more prone to stinging. The one challenge, though, is that they do seem to want to associate with human habitat. So the human hornet interaction may be higher than some other species, and these nests have larger numbers of individuals. Compared to like a paper wasp nest or a yellow jacket nest, which might have, a yellow jacket nest may have a few hundred yellow jackets in it. This nest might have a few hundred or 1,000 larger flying insects. So if they do get disturbed, there's a chance that these nests, that humans might get injured. But we don't think they're any more of a threat for anaphylaxis or hospitalization than any of our other native stinging insects, except for that they just might be a little bit more closely associated with people. Thankfully, though, over in France, they really didn't report increases in hospitalizations as hornet activity increased across the nation. The big problem, though, is this hot spotting thing. So like I mentioned, they seem to associate with human habitat, which means that these overwintering queens are going to be seeking sheltered locations, which might be a wood pile, the ballast of a boat, underneath a camper in that cavity that's up under there, or in a truck or trailer. I mean, any sort of habitat that provides them protection, but is also mobile, does seem quite likely to transport these to a new place. And it's all about timing. They're going to be going into that winter diapause in November and then be coming out of it in late February, March period. So movement of equipment in that time frame does suggest that the hornets might get transported with them. And the York County population pretty much confirmed that for us. So if that's the case, where are they going to go? I mean, where can they go? I guess is the better question. Um, there's not a lot of information specifically for North America because we hadn't had them yet, but there are a couple models. Barbet and Masson, they developed a European model because they wanted to know how much Europe was going to have to spend as this hornet spread across the continent. Um, in their modeling, they also, included other areas in the world that had similar climates. And so you see the green and yellow in the top right image. The green sort of indicates the intensity of where the hornets are. But notice their model completely missed where the hornets actually already exist down in the Malayan Peninsula and Southeast Asia. So there's something not quite right with the model. And then if you look at North America, areas like Louisiana, which is identical habitat to where they are right now in southern Georgia and South Carolina, is not lit up. So I firmly believe that this is an underestimate of where they can survive and thrive in North America. The only other model we got to look at is one that's from Korea, where they look more like just climatic stuff and not necessarily habitat stuff. And red is the more intense color. And you notice pretty much the entire eastern half of the nation is suitable for the yellow-legged hornet, all the way up to Canada. And they sort of dissipate as they get closer to Canada, probably due to the colder temperatures. But then they also could get down into the tropics of South America, which does seem quite plausible. So probably the reality is somewhere in between the two. Their potential for expanding range in North America suggests that they pretty much can live just about anywhere in the eastern half of the United States and Pacific Northwest. And then they will sort of decline in number as they get higher in latitude or drier. That doesn't mean, though, that they couldn't show up for a season. While they may not actually be able to reproduce and overwinter in these submarginal habitats like the desert Southwest or the high alpines of the Rocky Mountains, doesn't mean that somebody visiting the Southeast couldn't pick one up with them as they move back out west in the spring. And all of a sudden you get a hornet nest colony show up in New Mexico that plagues beekeepers for a season. May not be able to reproduce and survive. We don't necessarily know. But the fact that they can hitch a ride does mean that just about any state in the nation should be, and beekeeper in the nation should be aware of what these things look like and how to identify them. So with that great potential for spread, we need to talk about control and management. We need to talk about it at the landscape scale and at the beekeeper scale and the apiary scale. To do that, we're going to talk about IPM, integrated pest management. And to do integrated pest management for this particular creature is a challenge because we don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox yet. First and foremost, though, everybody needs to know what they're looking at. Need to be able to identify the hornets, their hawking behavior, and what the nests look like. Early detection is going to be essential for stopping these hot spots. If you can catch the nests in that first season before they get to that reproductive event at the end of the season, you'll shut down that population. So if you can get sped up on what these things look like and what the nests look like, and be vigilant for them, then you can detect those populations early and prevent them from establishing remotely. And then what we suggest is that you work with your state authorities to do the notification and nest removals. Most states have an ability to identify pests and have public reporting portals for you to submit images or other things. In the Southeast, where the threat is imminent, most of the states have an actual dedicated yellow-legged hornet reporting portal. So South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, I think Mississippi's got one too. I'm sure Alabama and Tennessee are right behind. But even without a dedicated yellow-legged hornet reporting portal, you have an agency that's responsible for novel pests and invasive species, usually associated with the Department of Agriculture or your university's extension service. So if you see something, say something, get a picture of it, get to your extension office or get to the Department of Ag to confirm whether or not it is yellow-legged hornet. And we would just suggest that beekeepers become familiar with who that agency is in your state. Now, part of that monitoring and early detection means using some traps. Now, I'm not necessarily saying every beekeeper in the nation needs to go out and start putting out traps. But what we do suggest is if you're in the immediate vicinity of where these hornets are, Georgia and South Carolina beekeepers, Florida, North Carolina, some of y'all may want to consider start. But trapping will help you with early detection. Trapping also provides a mechanical control, but I'm gonna get back to that in a second. Catching queens before they come form a nest, that's pretty important. But anyway, so the traps that we use are just a half-gallon jug trap with a hole drilled in it and filled up with grape juice and brown sugar in equal parts. So like a cup of each or 2 cups of each. Makes plenty of bait, lasts for about a week to 2 weeks before it gets super funky. But that bait has been very effective at luring in the hornets, but it is not very attractive to honeybees. So it's actually a trap you could use near your bee yard and not worry about killing a bunch of honeybees. You're going to catch some bycatch, though. You'll catch bald-faced hornets, yellow jackets, some wasps, maybe some beetles and flies in there as well. But at least by monitoring like that, especially if you're in the immediate vicinity where these hornets are, you'll have some sense of early detection. If you want to learn more about building these traps and how to bait them and hang them, Brad's got a video. So Brad Kevin is running our trapping and nest removal program. He's on the front lines for yellow-legged hornet management. So if you have any questions about how our state is handling it, he's the guy to talk to. Our reporting portals and our traps are getting all kinds of submissions and specimens in them. We most frequently get in our reporting portals bald-faced hornets, robber flies, and yellow jackets. Some years, 1 year, we got a lot of cicada killers because it just happened to be a big emergence of cicadas that year. And then European hornets. So a lot of things that look pretty close. We also get some things that don't necessarily look so close, some beetles and flies and a few other things. So what I would suggest to you is we're going to have bald-faced hornet specimens for you to look at at NABI and some other conferences. Take a look at them up close. But if you want to know what it looks almost exactly like a bald-faced hornet that's yellow and black, not white and black. The yellow-legged hornet is almost entirely black, except for the tips of its legs and the tip of its abdomen, and one little yellow band on the abdomen. The bald-faced hornet has got a white face and white tip to the abdomen. You can distinguish them even while they're flying in front of you. The second closest is actually the European hornet, but the European hornet is very vibrant compared to the yellow-legged hornet. It's much yellower, redder, brighter colored, has these little teardrops in the abdomen. It's pretty easy to distinguish them even while they're flying around. So, know what you're looking for, be able to identify them and report them if you see them so that you can stop these foundry populations as they pop up. The question then is, well, what do I do for my bees? I mean, like, to some degree, that's in the hands of the state or the contractors or whatever. I mean, what can I do in my bee yard? And I think the most important thing that you can do for your bees is to make sure that the bees are as happy and as healthy as possible. Um, Honeybees have the remarkable ability to produce thousands of workers, which overcomes predation. There's more workers produced than the predators can actually consume in general. And as long as that colony is able to raise new bees and build up winter stores, then it will overcome yellow-legged hornet pressure. The problem is they stop foraging when the yellow-legged hornets show up. So probably the best thing you can do is just check your bees and make sure that they have winter food. Feed your bees in the fall. And a lot of beekeepers are already doing this anyway. They're building up winter stores, adding weight to their colonies, and that helps the bees in general. But maybe if you've got weaker colonies that are already kind of having trouble, combining weaker colonies and feeding them, that's probably the best way to ensure overwintering success. I would avoid open feeding. We found these hornets come to any sugary sweet substances by having an open feeder in the yard. You're just adding one more attractant to lure more hornets in. So feed inside the hive, and that will reduce the attractants to the yellow-legged hornet. Also, stay on top of your varroa. I've had a few calls from beekeepers that claimed that the yellow-legged hornet had killed their bee colony. And after talking with them and going through some questions, it became evident that those colonies were already having trouble. They were weak and they were largely having problems with varroa mites. Most of the beekeepers that claimed that the hornet killed their colony had not done any treatments, hadn't even measured their mites at all that year. So the likelihood of in the fall, a colony dying or leaving because of hornets seems a whole lot less likely than because of the mites. I still believe mites are your biggest threat, but good mite management is going to be good hornet management because you're going to have stronger colonies that are better fed going into the fall of the year when pressure increases. For those of you that migrate bees, better timing of your migrations will be important, especially if you're moving in and out of yellow-legged hornet areas. If the hornets expand across the southeast, they're going to expand into areas that are the favored wintering grounds for migratory beekeepers. We have a large number of them in South Carolina that come down to produce queens, make splits, raise bees to get them ready for pollination contracts and honey production in other parts of the country. So they tend to move into the Carolina Low Country around October, and that mild climate that they move into stimulates the bees. So the bees actually build, even though it's almost winter time. Their bees come out stronger in winter because of moving them down into this mild climate. The problem with that is if you're migrating bees into the area right at peak hornet activity, might mean that actually is counterproductive, that the bee colonies now decline because you just moved bees into hornet areas right at the peak foraging time of year. So what we're suggesting is if you migrate into yellow-legged hornet areas, you probably want to delay your migration a little bit to November. That'll get you past that peak, and the hornet colonies are going to disperse and the predation on honeybees is going to decline. So if you can delay just a little bit, a couple of weeks to get you into November, that might be helpful. The other part, though, is what do you do when you're moving out? Because the bees are oftentimes being fed in these wintertime, that means there's attractants for the hornets. And I do have concerns that bee equipment that's not being used, or tractors or trailers or other storage containers that are being used for bee stuff that might get moved with the bees, a hornet might find that a suitable wintering spot. And you move that equipment out in February or March before those hornets actually emerge, then you may take hornets with you. So it's going to be very you need to be very careful about how equipment is managed and moved in the operation. Not to say that beekeepers are going to move hornets any more than the general public will. It's just part of the equation now. I think a resident who moves a boat into this area for the wintertime and then leaves in March to go home is just as likely to carry a hornet as a beekeeper would. Um, but because the hornets associate with honeybees, that does mean that there's a likelihood that these hornets may find bee equipment as suitable wintering spot. If you could delay moving out of the area until after the queens emerge, then you will likely have equipment that won't have any of these diapausing queens in there. So many of our beekeepers do this anyway. They might send some of their stuff out for pollination contracts, but they won't move out until the nectar flow is done. So our nectar flow typically is April, May, which gets us past the hornet wintering period. And that means if you're not moving out till April or May, the threat of moving a hornet with you and your bee equipment seems to be almost negligible. So that's it for the cultural stuff. And I mean, I'm sure there's going to be some new stuff we learn as we experience the things over time. But the question is like, do I have anything I can do to actually protect the hive? You know, is it like once the hornets show up, what do I do? Well, there's not a lot. At this point, you know, the Europeans have come up with some devices that seem to help. I'm not sure we've had a chance to test them and see how effective they are, but I'm going to run on their observations. There are muzzles or shrouds or funnels that you can buy for your hive entrances, and the idea is that the bees can get a little flying start, you know, get a little momentum as they're coming and going, and so they have the ability to fly past the hornets if there's a lot of pressure, and that muzzle or that shroud keeps the hornets further away from the beehive entrance and less likely to catch those foragers right as they're slowing down. Um, I don't know. We're going to have to test that out and see how that works and what materials and what are our distance. I'm not sure we have a great recommendation there. So there's a lot of unknowns in that world. What has been somewhat effective for the European beekeepers are these electric harps. Now, the harps are a series of wires that are electrified and they're gapped such that honeybees can fly right through them, and the honeybees can't close the circuit so they don't get zapped. Even if they bump into a wire, they don't die. The hornets, though, fly through and their wings are wide enough that they actually touch both wires, close the circuit, and get zapped, which is pretty effective way of pinpointing the hornet. Um, and the way it works is, you know, the hornet finds a bee colony or an apiary and starts foraging on those bees and then goes back and then another hornet comes and show that. And so they start building up this attack force of hornets. Well, if you kill one hornet and it's not able to return to the colony to report, we're not exactly sure how they communicate or if they communicate where these bee colonies are. But if you knock that hornet, it's less likely they're recruiting more hornets to your apiary. So a harp may be fairly effective. The question is, how expensive is that going to be for protecting multiple apiaries? And how do you place it? Where do you orient it? How many do you need? How big does it need to be? What's the current? I mean, there's a lot of factors still yet to be determined on that. But if you started getting hornet activity, a harp or even a handheld harp might be effective. You know, they do have those little electrified flash waters and badminton rackets and so forth. If you want to go manual, that's going to be a lot of work on your part, but it could be somewhat effective. The real best mechanical control that we know of, though, is if hornets are active in your area, trapping in the spring to catch queens is probably going to be the best way to reduce the number of nests in the environment around you. And these traps between the end of February and the end of April, or maybe beginning of May period, should be very effective at knocking queen hornets out. We do not have any biological controls, at least not on the market that I know of. We've been observing the hornets for a couple of years now and really have not seen any major predation. There don't seem to be any other insects in these nests affecting the hornets. There don't seem to be any predatory animals really affecting them. But we've seen bats flying around the nest and maybe picking off some of these hornets, but not in an appreciable way that will actually lead to control. So we don't believe that there's a natural predator that's effective on the hornet. There may be some pathogens, though, things like parasitic nematodes or bacteria, funguses that might actually work. So there's some research working on that, but there's no labeled products on the market yet. Now, chemical controls, um, that's largely for nest removal. We don't have any registered products for around beehives. And even if we did, they probably wouldn't work very well because the hornets just don't go in the beehive. They hover around the entrance. So unless you develop some sort of fogging device or something like that, which is probably going to affect the bees more or as much as the hornets, applying pesticides in the bee yard for hornets just does not seem like a suitable way of managing them. And there are no registered baits. Putting a bait that also attracts things like bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets and beneficial predatory insects that we already have native, that's just not a very effective way of targeting this invasive pest. There may be some work to be done on that front, but right now we do not recommend that you try to bait or put out some sort of mixture with a pet toxin in it to try to kill hornets, because you're likely going to kill more beneficial stuff than you are the hornets themselves. As for nest removals, right now we are using insecticides injected into the nest that provide quick kill. The idea is we want to get the queen and as many workers and all the brood out and dead as quickly as possible. Don't give a chance for that queen and some of those workers to leave and go find a new home. So we use pyrethroids mostly in our nest eradications. There may be some work to be done on other compounds that could be used more remotely, but again, nothing labeled or registered for that use. And really, in all honesty, the general public and even beekeepers shouldn't be treating these nests themselves anyhow. We're still in the early phases of the introduction, and agencies and state personnel need to be involved in this. One, for tracking and monitoring and learning and data logging, but two, because we want to minimize the threat to the public, both in the hornets injuring them, but also in the use of pesticide. So the best thing to do is if you find a nest, report it. And there are agencies there to respond. So our control options are fairly limited, but it doesn't mean that we're not looking for new ways to manage this pest. In fact, there are a number of labs that are working on this right now. So to my knowledge, currently, University of Florida's Bee Lab is working on trying to detect the hornets earlier in the season using eDNA. It doesn't seem like it's working all that well because the hornets don't want to land, but there may be some validation there. If we can detect hornets early in the season before they start pressuring honeybees, then maybe we can find those nests and remove them before the beekeepers ever see hawking start. They're also working on some general biology and life history stuff, dynamics of the nest and phenology and all that stuff. Their counterparts over the Department of Ag are working on some genetic stuff, like determining if there's microsatellites. So if we got a trap filled with hornets and we can determine how many different nests are actually represented in that trap, then we will know how effective our trapping or nest removal is being. So if I find a trap and it's only got one nest represented in that trap and I kill that nest, I've removed the hornets from that area. But if I have two or three, then now I know, oh, I killed a nest. I still got two more to work at. And so microsatellite might be helpful for increasing the efficacy of our trapping programs. They're also working on pheromones and lures, trying to, maybe catch the drones by mimicking the queens And that way the queens don't get mated very well, and there's more inbreeding, and that results in nest collapse and so forth. That's been looked at for a while now. Not a lot's been found. So we hope that maybe some pheromone trapping will be on the horizon. And then risk modeling, what areas are most likely going to get the hornets. Similarly, Georgia's labs are working on stuff, right there on the front lines. And Georgia has been trying to determine, where the hornets actually come from. What is their diversity? I mean, how many, parental lineages are there? How diverse are they really? And maybe we can bottleneck it, and that can help with management. They've been trying to figure out, what are they actually eating? What's in the diet? And then more modeling and distribution information. At West Virginia, Dr. Park is trying to train drones to use AI to detect nests. So flying over the tree canopy, can you not detect the nest using smart technology? It's going to be a challenge because of the canopy and the extensive vegetation we have in the areas where this is. But we hope to see that maybe some modern technology will help us. What we're working on in our lab is some more population dynamics. When exactly are we seeing these guides and drones produce? What are the nest dynamics? Where are these queens going in the wintertime? Can we develop some, attractants or things like that? And most importantly, the nest and its structure. And can we develop ways where we can treat these nests remotely to reduce our removal costs? This whole idea of hiring a crane or a cherry picker every time we got to remove a nest means that nest removals are extremely expensive. So we're working on ways to consider nest treatments in more cost-effective ways. And then also looking at what can we do around the hive? And we have some ideas, which I'm not going to divulge here. You're going to have to tune into the next presentation. And then my counterparts over in Department of Plant Industry are working on enhancing their nest tracking abilities. One challenge with this hornet is it's much smaller than the northern giant hornet, so it cannot carry a radio tracker like the hornet did up in Washington State. Luckily, a European company devised a tracker small enough that they're now using over in England, and we're trying to test that technology to see if maybe we can devise some sort of electronic tracking where we can trap a hornet and find its nest electronically. Still a lot to be determined on that area. And then Dr. Otis has already been working with hornets on trying to predict their distribution and modeling in North America. If you want to stay up to date on this stuff, we've got the website, but we're also producing regular periodicals on what's happening with hornets in both Georgia and South Carolina. In South Carolina, DPI is putting out the Hornet Herald. So if you look up Hornet Herald, you can get a monthly update on our trapping information, where the hornets are, what's been caught, how many have been caught, and what the potential is for them to be near you. Georgia, similarly, doing the Yellow-Legged Ledger, which is a monthly update for their trapping and nest removal activities. Of course, if you're tuned into this, and especially if you stayed all the way here to the end of the presentation, you're concerned. And if you have additional questions, suggestions, concerns about the hornet and would like to reach out to us, you are welcome to contact me directly or my counterparts at DPI. We would love to share with you what we've learned, and we would also love to learn from anybody else who has suggestions. This is a challenging pest, arguably one of the best adaptive invasive species that we've seen in decades. And it's going to become much more publicly prominent over the coming years. Anything that we can learn from each other as we work to protect our bee colonies and our beekeeping industry from this and other pests would be greatly welcome. So I look forward to hearing from you. I hope you enjoyed this and learned something from it. And I would be happy to help you out if you ever need me. Have a good day.